Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the second of the three sessions we'll be doing. Most people have arrived, so I'll get started. There's a lot to get through. Same format as last week. Keep video and mics off. If you want to ask a question, use the chat. Drop it in the chat, and I'll get to it at the end. And also, just to note that I am recording, so in terms of detail and things like that, you'll be able to look at the recording later if you wanted to. Today's session is a lot different from last week. There's quite a lot of sort of more involved things we're going to talk about, so that might be useful. We'll probably go for about 45-50 minutes on the first part, and we'll take a quick break. And then come back after that for the second half of the session, with the second half slightly shorter, so not really a half at all, but anyway. Okay, so I said last week that what we were looking at today was effectively more academic in focus than the practical stuff we talked about last week, and so I thought it's useful just to give you an overview of what we're actually going to cover. The focus of the session is to look at important tips, really, to get you started on the PhD as effectively as possible. And that involves a number of related areas. So what I'm going to do in the first part is look at some sort of contextual ideas about the PhD, and particularly some things that you need to bear in mind as you're starting one. And then we're going to focus very specifically on the assessment criteria, and I'm going to refer a little bit to how we assess the PhD. But fundamentally, it's looking at the things that you need to do in order to pass one, the examination. And that's the most important thing that you should take away in some respects, because without knowing that, it's very difficult to do very much at all in the right sorts of ways as you start your study. Then we're going to look at a few elements of the criteria that are particularly important to be aware of. And the one that I'm going to focus on is the idea of originality and what that means at this level. And then we're going to, I'll then move on specifically to look at first year work. It's a bit more complex than that, as you'll see. We talk about literature and resources and the use of literature and resources critically. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you some strategies you can use to get your head around effectively what you're going to need to be doing in that side of the PhD. And on the whole, we talk about the literature review. It's a way of sort of discussing that element of a thesis. All theses are going to have a literature review of some sort. So it's a nice way of sort of framing the first year, because the vast majority of the work in the first year will be getting those resources in place and understanding how that relates to your project and defines your project for you. So it's sort of real practical in that sense, that you'll be doing this in the first year. So having a good idea about what that looks like, the scale of the job, is quite a useful thing to have at this point. And I'm going to focus specifically on this idea of criticality, or the idea of a literature review at this level being more than simply a survey of source material, but what you need to be doing with it forms such an integral part of PhD level work that it's really, and it's often quite something that is difficult to grasp when you're coming from a talk program. The level of criticality that's required. So I'll talk a little bit about that. And then on the downward slope of the session, I will talk a little bit about the presentation of the thesis, and this is mainly so that you understand what it is that you're going to have to produce at the end, because ultimately when you submit a document, the thesis. It could also have supporting things with it. It depends on what kind of work you're doing, but everyone submits at least some form of written document. And what that looks like can be very varied. But there are some things that are standardized, so I'll run you through some of that, and I'll also talk you through a little bit about what the presentation and the format of the thesis implies for how you go about doing the work itself, because ultimately you have to defend the thesis you submit. The written document has to be defended, and that's the word we use in the oral examination. And therefore, there are some things that are really good to start thinking about early on in terms of what you'll be doing at the end in that oral examination. So the thesis needs to be something that you can stand behind. And there's some implications to that in terms of how you go about doing the work, and I'll talk you through some of that. I'll talk a little bit about some of the supporting apparatus that needs to be there for what I've called scholarly tools. There are basic standards of scholarship which you will need to be using, and I'll run through some of that really quickly. And then there's certain things that are expected at the PhD level that you won't probably have been expected to do previously. So I'll just reinforce some of that. And then lastly, I'll talk about the really important element in being successful, which is that you've got to manage the project. You've got to be organised. A PhD, as will become clear, is a massive bit of work. It lasts at least 3.5 to 4 years if you're full-time, and a lot longer if you're part-time. And being organised and managing the project effectively is number one priority, I would say, because without it, you will easily get swamped. So some tips on that, and some ideas about how you can manage your time across the registration, which I talked about last week, has been 4 years or 7 years. It seems like a long time now as you're starting, but it quickly disappears. And so having some idea about how you can manage the time when in reality the structure of the PhD is fairly open, as I talked about last week, really important. And I can say in terms of success, let's see, at PhD level, that the vast majority of students who end up struggling, quite a lot of those students who struggle will do so not because they're not able to do the project or that the study's too challenging or whatever. It's simply a matter of organisation and management of the project that basically sinks the project. So it's really important to understand that, the importance of that. So those of you who are really already organised, good at managing your work and so on, will probably walk that aspect. But I know from experience that a lot of students do struggle because of the volume of work that's needed, the amount of referencing, the amount of data, and so on and so on. It can become overwhelming. So having a good understanding of that and how you can better manage it if you're not so organized is also quite important. Right, so I'll get started on the main part of the presentation. So I'm going to start off with sort of summarizing some of the key differences between level 8 doctorate level work, and I'm fortunate today that none of you are doing an MPhil, because that does make this slightly more tricky to elaborate on, but all of you are doing PhDs. The doctorate is a level 8 qualification, which in the UK system is the highest level qualification you can obtain. And the fact that it's the highest level should tell you something about it, which is that it's difficult. And its difficulty is not just in the fact, as I talked about last week, that it's unstructured, largely unstructured. You don't have any lectures, you don't have anything in terms of modules, you don't have anything that breaks the study down into sort of digestible pieces. It's one big project that you were examined on at the end. I talked a little bit last week about the annual review as being our way of checking in with you, and that's about as much as we do formally from the assessment side. So the level 8, the higher level nature of this means that you need to grasp very early on, and hopefully you will take that away today, about what that means in terms of its difference from your previous experience as a student. So all of you will have done an undergraduate degree, and the majority of you I know will have done a level 7 masters or taught masters. But there are some distinguishing features at this level which are so different from what you'll have done before that it's really important to sort of understand what those differences are. So as a starting point, we can say that at PhD level, you are doing research, pure research, independent research. That's the entire content of the study. And doing that research will, in many respects, look like what other people doing research do in projects, whether that be a small piece of research, a piece of commercial research, whatever. The methods used, the approaches taken will all be across the piece fairly similar. But the difference is that if you're doing a doctorate, you're doing it to be assessed. So a really important thing to bear in mind is that you are having to produce an output, which we'll call the thesis, which meets accepted standards for research, but it also has to meet our assessment criteria. And so you have to find a balance between what it means to do research, the process of doing research, producing an output, which talks about the process of research and what you found and all of those elements that are part and parcel of research. But you also, as part of that, have to evidence that you've met the criteria for assessment. So there are many great researchers out there who've never done a doctorate, and they are fantastically well experienced researchers whose research wouldn't necessarily, if assessed for PhD, actually pass the PhD assessment. And that's a really important thing to grasp, because you'll be reading papers, you'll be reading various work as you go through your project, which are of a high standard in terms of research, but in themselves wouldn't and don't evidence the sorts of things that you're going to have to. So one of the important things that I need to get across to you today is what those criteria that you have to evidence are. And this is an important thing in the sense that when you're doing research, it's very easy to get carried away with a topic, with the data you've got, and you sort of get immersed in it. But you've always got to keep in mind that ultimately at the end of this project, you're going to have to defend that work in an examination. And the examiners are going to be looking not just for high quality research, and not just that you've done what they expect to see. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what that looks like in a minute. But also that you've evidenced the key criteria for doctoral level work. So those are really important things to bear in mind as you get started. And you'll see that I've highlighted here those three things I've sort of talked about a little bit. You've got to have a project which is well defined, that's viable, that you can do it. These are words you're going to hear me using a lot. Viability, that the project's manageable within the time you've got, and that you manage the project properly and be organized. And those three things are really vital. And I'll talk a little bit more about definition of viability as part of the session today. So things to avoid, if you like. It's very easy to get caught in misunderstandings about what it is you're doing. What I've just said to you a little bit about research and assessment should give you a hint here, but it's really important not to fall into the trap that you're just doing research. Okay, yes, you are. That's the fundamental part of it, is doing research, but you're not just doing research. As I said, you've got to also be always thinking of this assessment component. How can I defend those ideas? How can I defend what I've done? Those are what you're going to have to do at the Viva in the end. So you've always got to have that in the back of your mind. Secondly, those of you who've done advanced level work at master's level, it's a very different approach than you'll be using for your doctorate. It's not just a harder course. It's not just a harder version of what you've done at master's. It's entirely different because of the structure of what you're doing is basically open. And that means that certain things that you may have encountered before at master's level will look very different at doctoral level. And I'll give you an example. If at a master's level you struggle with a particular module, and each module on a master's would be individually examined, you could resit it. At doctoral level, you don't really. We have some parallels, but they're not the same. Ultimately, you've got one big piece of work that you submit, and at the end, you're examined on it. And at that point, it's basically pass or fail. There are opportunities for the equivalent of a resit, but ultimately you only get 2 goals at it. So you're working for a very long period of time with very little guidance other than your supervision in an area where there is a possibility that you will encounter challenges in terms of getting data, that the project needs to change. Regularly happens that projects need to adapt and change to circumstances. You may find that things take a massive directional change halfway through. That's very common. So you've got to be able to be prepared to adapt and be flexible as you're going through it, in order that at the end you can submit something that you can defend and that meets the criteria. So this difference between what you're going to be doing and what you've previously done is really important to grasp. So don't come into the doctorate and start work thinking that ultimately you've done this sort of thing before, because you haven't. And you need to be prepared for surprises, and you need to be prepared for things to be, well, occasionally you might need to totally change your approach to what you're doing, which is very different from what you would get on a taught degree. So this is what I would describe as a qualitative difference. There's a massive, massive gap between the kind of educational experience you've had previously and what you're going to get at PhD level. And one of the reasons for that is that the PhD is largely self-directed. Yes, you've got supervisors. Yes, you've got support, but ultimately this is your project. You drive it forward. You're the one who decides, makes decisions about where it's going. And some of you may not like to hear this, but ultimately you will also be assessed on your ability to demonstrate that you've done that. And you'll see in a second when I show you the criteria. If there's anything that's a good parallel with what you'll experience at the end for the oral examination, and the way that this whole thing works at PhD level, is it's actually a form of peer review. So if you submit a paper to a journal, and we'll talk a little bit about this bit more next week, actually, when we look at publishing. When you submit a paper to a journal, what happens to that paper is it is sent out for review by various members of the peer review body for that particular journal, and they'll provide critical remarks and basically advise whether they think the paper can be published. PhD examination is not that different, in that you will have examiners who are given your work to review and then ask you questions about it. And what they're ultimately doing is agreeing whether or not you merit being admitted to the group, the peer group that in that particular discipline that you're working in. And so it's a very different from the sort of things you'll have experienced being examined for a taught course, where the measures by which you pass or fail, or the grade you get and so on, are determined via a lot of the things that you're assessed on are determined independently of that sort of thing. What you get at doctoral level is one-to-one examination with peers who are your examiners, and that's really, really important. And that's why, in many ways, for a lot of students, the oral examination is a stressful experience, because it's very different from the sort of thing you will previously have done. So, assessment criteria. So, in terms of the things that in the regulations I referred you to last week, I mentioned that you don't need to be familiar with in detail with the content of the regulations. You should be aware of their existence. You should know where they are. You should, if you need to look something up, they're there for you to look at. But most of it, you will only need to know if you need to do something specifically. You need to know, for instance, how to make a declaration for submission and things like that. But that's one exception to that, is this paragraph that's on this slide. Okay, so if you're going to know anything from the regulations, this is it. This is in the section called RDCA. It's the framework, and it's where we set out the assessment criteria for the award of PhD. And it looks very simple here on this slide. What I've done is I've highlighted in blue what the criteria are in that paragraph, and I'll read it, and then we'll go through them individually. Just have and I'm going to come back to this throughout the rest of the session, really, but so you're aware of them. So the degree of PhD should be awarded to a candidate who, having critically investigated and evaluated an approved topic, resulted in an independent and original contribution to knowledge, has demonstrated an understanding of research methods appropriate to the chosen field, and has presented and defended a thesis in oral examination to the satisfaction of the examiners. That sounds so straightforward at that level. I haven't rated or graded those criteria in terms of what I think the most important are, but actually the most important one is the last one, to the satisfaction of the examiners, because the reality is, because the examination is a form of peer review, the only people who count ultimately for your success are the examiners, because regardless of how well the work you think you've done the work, and more importantly in some cases, regardless of how well you think your supervisors think the work is, how good they think it is, all of that is irrelevant if the examiners disagree. So ultimately, you always have to have in mind that you have to satisfy the people nominated and approved to be the examiners for your work. I won't go into how we do that in this session because there's other opportunities to get some support on the examination side a bit later on. But ultimately, examiners for your work will be chosen individually, specifically for your PhD. They'll be nominated closer to the end of the project in your final year, and we'll approve them on the basis of various things that they need to provide to us to show that they're eligible to examine you and so on. But the importance of their role for you is, it cannot be overstated really, because of this final bit in the criteria, that they have to be satisfied. If they're not satisfied, there are options, which I won't go into today, but ultimately you have to always have in the back of your mind, this is what you've ultimately got to do at the end. You've got to sit in a room or online, depends on how you go about. We do online vivas at the moment. We'll continue with that as well as an in-person viva. And you've got to defend your work to them orally. And they'll be asking you questions, and they'll be trying to get at and unpack various other elements of these criteria that they see in your work. So there's lots and lots that rides on that situation with the examiners asking you questions. So bear that in mind at all times, ultimately, as you're going through the PhD. So the other criteria and the things that they're examining you on are, I think, it's difficult to say that this is more important than anything else, but the one that a PhD stands and falls on is this one in the middle, the independent and original contribution to knowledge. So the difference between an MPhil and a PhD, apart from the fact that the PhD is longer and has to have more in it, is that the MPhil doesn't require you to make an original contribution to knowledge. It has to be independent and it needs to make a contribution of some sort, but it doesn't have to be completely original. And this issue of originality is a fundamental element of PhD assessment. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about it. But also this nature of independence is really, really important as well. As I've talked a little bit about that you've got to drive the project, you've got to focus the project yourself. Your supervisors are there to support you in that. They're not there to do it for you. And different supervisors will have different approaches to how they get you to get to the end point, if you like. Some supervisors may well give you lots of structured work to do in order for a certain point, to get you to a certain point where you can do it yourself. Some supervisors will let you make mistakes in order to learn from them. Some supervisors will leave you alone and just expect you to get on with it, and then they'll expect you to see work and so on occasionally from you. It's very variable depending on the discipline you're in and the type of supervisor you have. But ultimately, none of that is really that important, because ultimately, in the end, you've got to demonstrate it's your work and you've done it independently and it's your ideas and that you can argue for them and defend them. So that independence bit is really, really important. Again, some people love that. Some people really like the fact that the structure is for them to decide. And some people aren't so happy with it. They like a little bit more structure. But again, that can be something that you agree with the supervisor about how you want to achieve that, how you want to work. Those are all really important things to discuss in these early weeks with the people supervising you, principally the director of studies. The other issues here are other sort of stuff of research. So critical investigation and evaluation, we're going to talk about today. So the criticality and the evaluation are fundamental. It's not sufficient to just produce work of your own. You have to have ways in which you can show it in relationship to the work of others. And to do that, you have to do a critical investigation and evaluation of the work of others through the literature. And then the other element that's fundamental to research of all types is this demonstration of an understanding of research methods. And this is the real substance of pretty much any PhD thesis, is its methodology. So what we end up with is, in different disciplines, obviously this is going to look very different. But the fundamental word there is demonstrated. So it's not sufficient to just for an example, go into the lab and do a lot of experiments and produce an output. You have to document all of the elements and processes that went into the methods. Likewise, if you're doing work in, say, social sciences, you have to demonstrate an understanding of all the various options you have available to you doing qualitative research, for instance. It's not sufficient to say, this is what I've decided to do, and this is what I did. You need to give a far wider description of why you've done it that way and what the alternatives, the positives, the pros and cons are of all the various options you have available. So demonstration of an understanding of research methods appropriate to the chosen field is really important. So they will look very different in the bench sciences from the social sciences and the humanities. There's a lot of differences between the way those methods work in the different disciplines. So the key thing is that you need to be aware of what that looks like for your particular discipline and particularly for your project, and be aware of all the various methodological issues that could have an effect on it, because you can absolutely guarantee that when you get in that oral examination, a significant proportion of the viva is going to be spent discussing your methods and methodological choices and decisions and things like that. And again, that will vary from discipline to discipline. In bench sciences, it tends to be based upon measurement and equipment and techniques. In the more qualitative theoretical side of things, it'll be a whole range of issues to do with the validity of the data, issues to do with theory and so on. And again, I'm going to talk a little bit about that next week a bit more. So you have to fairly early on, and the way you do that is through the literature, get an understanding of what the range of potential methodological issues are going to be for your topic in your discipline, because you can guarantee you're going to get asked a lot about it at the Viva. And it is probably, along with the original contribution, the thing that will scupper a PhD at Viva if it's not thoroughly thought through. And examiners love talking about methods. They love picking holes in people's methods. So it's very wise to get on this fairly early on in terms of getting a grasp on your understanding of what, getting an understanding of what you need to understand, if you like, early on, and then starting to put together the right sort of reading in order to solidify your grasp of it. So that is, in a nutshell, the assessment criteria. And I'm going to come back to these over the rest of the session and again next week. We'll talk about it from a different angle next week, but it's still the same sorts of issues. And I'm going to unpack a couple of these in the rest of the session. So here's some useful supporting material for this issue about examiners being satisfied. So part of my role is that I oversee the examination system, and I have a lot of interaction with examiners, usually after the Viva, not prior to. I approve examiners in tandem with colleagues, but one of the things I deal with is after a Viva and examination, I will then be interacting with the examiners, various reports and things like that that then get sent to the student in order to follow up on the examination, whether it's positive or negative. And so I get to see a lot of information from examiners about their view on the work that's been examined. And what is surprising to me, even though there is a great variance of differences between the disciplines and the types of projects that are examined and the types of students and the type of examiners, there are some remarkable consistencies in what they say. Usually, when a piece of work has not been very good, they'll have very similar things to say about it, but they will also be looking for very similar sorts of things. And that leads me over 10 years of doing this work principally at the university, that there are some very key things here, and they're what I would call fundamental scholarship issues. So get this stuff right and you're more likely to be successful. So this first one here, I think, is a really good example. A pertinent literature review, a clear hypothesis, doable problem, sound data analysis methodology, and justifiable conclusions. And that's an example of what an examiner, in this particular case, it was some kind of natural science with the idea of the hypothesis and so on. Basically, the examiner was looking for these things. That sentence was followed by the following sentence, none of which this thesis did. This was a negative examination outcome. So this was, in this examiner's view, the sort of thing they were looking for in a PhD thesis. And I would say, on the whole, if you do those things well, you're doing okay. And I'll come back to some of this in the rest of the session. It's really important before you all start getting a bit nervous about examination that in reality, examiners are reluctant to fail a thesis. They understand the amount of work, blood, sweat, and tears that have gone into a PhD. And so, they are likely to be gracious about what's wrong with the thesis and try and help you to get it up to standard. And that, in fact, is the process we use at examination. So if you don't pass, then you get a chance to, on the whole, get a chance to revise it. And the examiners provide you with what they think you need to do. But the key thing is that you've got to demonstrate that you've got sufficient work there for them to do that. And it's this key idea of demonstrating what you know and what you've done that you'll hear me talk a lot about. And then, many students are very focused on the research. They want good data, they want good outputs. And, it's not always presented in the best way. And although presentation on the whole is not something that a thesis would be failed on, where it would be on poor data or poor methods, it's important to bear in mind that an examiner who you're trying to satisfy is going to have their experience and perception of your work shaped by what they see on the page. And therefore, the presentation about what this work's about will be informed by the impression that your work gives them in terms of the way it's presented. It's really important to have that stuff right. And it's the one thing that you have complete control over, is the way that it looks and how you present it. Again, those choices are generally left up to you and your supervisors. So don't overlook that, because it makes the examiner's job easier if the work is presented nicely and easily and they can find their way around in it. If you make their job harder, they're less predisposed to be charitable when you might make mistakes that they find and so on. So presentation is important, and I'm a stickler for it, but it is an important one to get right, I think, at this level. And I should say that if you're used to being submitting work at master's or undergraduate level and being let off for poor grammar and so on, that won't happen at PhD. You'll have to correct all those mistakes before you get the degree. So it's worth getting this stuff right as soon as you can earlier on. And then lastly, the fundamental thing is that what examiners are looking for is a work that meets their expectations about what they would expect to see in your discipline. So they want to see you demonstrating that you have what it takes to do research at this level, and that you can present the work, you can talk about it. There's a certain factor that they're looking for, and of course the oral examination gives them the opportunity to see that by asking you questions and the way you answer them. And so the oral examination is a fundamental element of the whole process, because it's not just the written work, but the way you defend it that makes the difference in the examination. So it's perfectly good, or perfectly possible, to have a fantastic piece of written work and do a really appalling viva defense and not pass, and vice versa, to have a pretty poorly written thesis but be stellar in the viva and give yourself a chance because you can talk about it. Ideally, you want to have both. So this lots of things. And between now and the point where you're going to be doing this, you'll have plenty of opportunity to practice talking about your work, to discuss your work with others, and to get feedback. So again, this is just a sort of long-term view about what examiners are looking for. Classic bugbears. And again, I'm going to come back to some of this when I'm talking about other bits and bobs later, and then next week as well. Things that are pretty consistently criticized by examiners, again, no particular discipline, they're just, this just happens, is student work which overclaims. And this is a word you'll hear me use quite a bit. It's where because you have to be original, because the contribution has to have originality and significance, it's not untypical for a student thesis to make bigger claims than it ought really to be making. So overclaiming originality or novelty. So this is made up, but it makes the point. So this sentence, "there is a complete absence of previous research on this topic," should never be seen in a PhD thesis, simply because that is an incredibly dangerous statement to make, simply because one single paper that the examiner's aware of that contradicts that statement proves that to be false. So it's really, really important to be aware of tendencies to overclaim. It's very, very easy to do it, and it can happen in a variety of ways. Too general a statement, very little evidence to support the claim, and so on and so on. But on the other hand, it's not untypical for students to do the very opposite, which is to actually not make clear what is genuinely original. So it's very, very common that students claim originality for things that aren't that original and actually don't talk about the things that are. Very, very commonly in theses, you will see this sort of thing happening. And there's a number of reasons for that. One of which is the sheer size of the thing you have to produce. You get bogged down at the very end of the PhD, you're writing, you've got reams of paper, 80 odd thousand words in many cases. It's very easy to just get lost in all that text and miss some of the obvious things, which is why supervisors are helpful, why it's useful to have other people looking at your work, giving papers at conferences and so on, because then you get feedback on things from other people who are your peers. Second thing that are bugbears for examiners are what I might call inept use of important terms. So one of the best ways to not demonstrate you have an understanding of a research method is to use terms inaccurately or incorrectly. So good examples here would be, and I'm picking just random examples from examples I've seen. In social science, someone describing a method as ethnographic when it's actually a case study, or somebody describing something that's in depth when actually it's a very cursory overview. And lastly, one of my bugbears as a philosopher is people using the word ontology incorrectly. But that's just an example of terms that are very specific or say something very specific that if you use them badly, give the game away, you don't know what you're doing. So it's really important to be careful when using the language and methodology and in theory to make sure you use terms precisely and in the accepted form in the discipline. I do other sessions on writing and so on where we'll look at this a bit more, but it's really important to be aware of what the impression it gives to use terms in certain ways. And if you're using them incorrectly, it doesn't reflect well on you or your work. But also for an examiner, it can flag up potentially other issues. So it's important to get that right. Talked about presentation, but the big one, the big bugbear, is typo errors in the abstract, which is the first thing the examiner will look at. And that's, it's the last thing you put together. You're usually very tired, you just want to get the thing submitted. But typos in the abstract are easily spotted and should be corrected because, again, they give the wrong impression. Referencing citations and formats, there's lots of different ways you can do this stuff, and I'll talk a little bit about it later, is consistency. So consistency of formats, consistency of citation, making sure you're citing the right things, all of this has to be right at level 8. Writing is, I'm fairly confident that this is the thing that the majority of students will have more of a problem with than anything else. Writing a PhD in the appropriate level and style is difficult because, again, there's so much writing to do. But if you know from right now that you're going to struggle with writing, then it's really important to start getting some practice or get some support with it. Because, again, no matter how good the research is, if it's not easy for an examiner to read, it's going to make it much more difficult for them to examine you and make your job harder as well. And they are going to expect it to be corrected before they'll pass you. So again, just thinking ahead, you're going to have to produce a big piece of work that for a lot of you will be 80,000 words. For some of you, it'll be about half that, depending on the nature of the work you're doing. But that's still a lot of words that you have to produce. And it has to be written to a particular standard in a particular style, and it has to be clear and present the work so that it can be examined. So in terms of writing, if you know now that you're going to struggle, think ahead, get some support. And don't, as I'm going to refer to you later, don't not write at all until the very end. Start writing early, and that way it's easier when you start to put the thesis together. And then last one, bugbear, is examiners who read the thesis and then go, I'm actually not sure what they did. The clarity of the point of the project. What was the point of this piece of research? And this is a bit more of a sort of contextual one, but it's very easy for us to get sort of a lack of focus on why the project is being done in the first place. We kind of get lost in the data. We get lost in the sort of in all the methodological stuff, and we don't actually see that someone like an examiner who's coming to it for the first time might just say, well, what's this research for? And these kind of questions are not to be overlooked, because ultimately this originality of a piece of work has to have a significance to it. So in other words, originality isn't sort of floating free form. It's got to be originality with a purpose, if you like. And examiners will struggle, and you will struggle in a Viva as well, unless you can articulate why you've done the project. And it's one of those things that not untypically students overlook, and they get surprised when an examiner asks about it. Right, so this original idea of originality is one of those things that makes a lot of students nervous. It's really, really important to have it in perspective. Yes, originality is crucial. It's the assessment criteria. It's something that you have to do at PhD level. You have to evidence the original contribution. But it's also really important to not let it dominate your thinking to the point where you start worrying about whether the work is original or not. So one thing that's counterintuitive is that actually one of the best ways to be original is simply to work incrementally towards achieving something you think will produce the original outcomes. And this is very, very typical. If you read properly in the literature, you are going to understand what that means, because you'll know where it's likely that if you work hard enough, focus in the right places and so on, that you'll find something that you can make a contribution with. A good way of thinking about it is at PhD level, if you think of the orange disc as the knowledge in the discipline, what you're doing at PhD is you're getting right to the edge of the known within the discipline. And all you have to effectively do is break through in a very small place on the circumference of this circle. You only have to nudge it, and that's sufficient. You do not have to shatter it. Some PhD work does shatter it. There's been some very famous instances in the last 100 odd years of this in various disciplines, but you don't have to do that. And in many ways, it's better to think of it in a limited way, whilst also accepting that you have to do it. And one of the important things, and why I like this diagram as a way of representing it, is that you, in order to break through the circumference of the known knowledge within the discipline, you have to find the right point, the point where it is weakest. And to do that, you've got to focus your search, and this is again literature-based work, on the part which is most likely to give way. And if you can do that, often people talk about things like the gap in knowledge. And that's a way of talking about this weak spot, if you like. You need to find it. And this is why it's really important to not be caught up in this idea that what you start out doing at PhD level is what you end up doing, because it might be that what you thought was the case isn't the case, and you have to shift focus to find the point that the circle will break. So that's a nice analogy for the sort of work you have to do at PhD level. It's not about shattering it. It's about nudging through and just creating a little extension at some point on that circumference. And focus and knowing where to look is the key part of that. So I'm going to just sort of give you a few ideas about originality, and then we will take a 5-minute break and come back and talk about some more practical things about doing that. So as I said, originality is actually poorly understood. In my view, and I'm not alone in this view, that you are most likely to achieve originality by focusing on the fundamentals. So you may have a big idea, you may have seen something that has given you idea to do a PhD in the first place. I want to do this because I think this is an area where I can make a contribution. You may have that. Everyone comes from a different place and with different experience. But ultimately, you've got to work towards achieving that by applying the fundamentals of scholarship. And I would say that at PhD level, there are three main areas where these fundamentals are. Firstly, you've got to have context for what you're doing. It's what I would call scoping. It means you've got to start out by thinking widely about what the area in which you work, the field in which you work, in order to give it context. Your PhD can only be original if you know what other people have done and what they haven't. So you've got to continually have one eye on what others are doing, right through the PhD, right up until your Viva. You've got to know where it fits, and you can only get that by doing work with literature. There are other things as well. I'll talk about that after our break. Other things you can do to stay on top of things. It's not necessarily all that difficult if you know how to do it. You've got to have an understanding of what's been done before and what is going on now, previous and ongoing work. It's important to have definition of the project. Why are you doing this and why are you doing it in this way? Continually asking yourself those questions will keep you on track. It is really, really easy to get bogged down and get off track. You start reading something really fascinating, and before you know it, 6 months have passed and you're in a completely different part of where you were from you started. So continue asking yourself, why am I doing this and why am I doing it in this way? And definition and focus are vital at PhD level. So you've got context, wide view, scoping of what's going on, but you've got to be focused in terms of what you're doing. And definition is the way you do that. So it's defining your aims, the terms, the language you're using, why you describe things in the way you describe them, the parameters in which you're working, and the limitations. And you will see often this sort of discussion in research papers, the limitations of this project, or why I've done what I've done in this way, which parameters I'm using. These are the kinds of things people talk about. It's about definition of what the project's trying to achieve and how. And then lastly, the methodological issues are so important that you've got to be absolutely confident that the way you're doing things and the methods you're using will give you what you actually are looking to achieve. So you've got to be confident that applying a particular new technique gives you what you think it gives you. You've got to be justified in decisions. And in a PhD, you've got to be able to spell those things out. So an examiner will ask you, I can guarantee that probably a good 75 to 80% of you will get asked a question like this at your Viva, which is, why did you do it that way and not another way? And you've got to be able to answer that question, because that's a case of justifying your choice about why you did it the way you did it. And this is the sort of thing at PhD level which can really, really confuse people if they're not ready for it. But it's a perfectly legitimate question, because at PhD level, you need to be able to say why a choice was made to use a particular method, because it links up with the contribution and the originality and the validity of the data, some of which I'll be talking again about next week. So again, really useful thing, questions you can use to keep yourself on track. So framing your project in terms of its originality, consistently asking yourself, what is the thing that I'm contributing here? What is it that I think I'm doing? You know, if you can't say it in a sentence, you're probably not quite there yet. Secondly, in order for significance to be there, you need to make sure that other people care about it. In other words, at least one other person needs to think what you're doing has got some significance, and one of those has to be an examiner. And thirdly, is it viable? So practicality cannot be overlooked. Yes, you've got 4 years or 7 years to do this study, but some projects will not be doable in that period, particularly if things go wrong. And I'll talk about a little bit about this at the end of the session. What happens if things don't work out the way that you want them to? And that's very common. So viability is important. So it's important to be ambitious, push at the boundaries, make sure that you're doing the right things to get where it is that you think you're going to go with the contribution. But at the same time, be always thinking about, well, is that doable? And this question of viability, really important, because nothing will scupper a project more quickly than taking too much on that you can't do and then getting demotivated, demoralized because it's not working. So it's much better to sort of make sure that you've got all those things in intention. What's the contribution? Why would anyone else care? And is it viable? All really important questions. So what I'd like to do now is take a quick break for 5 minutes to loo break, cup of tea, whatever, get away from the screen, come back at about 5 to 3 or so, and then we'll come back and talk about literature review and first year work and some management. And I'll see you in 5 minutes. Okay, we'll get started with the second half of the session. So I've just run you through a number of sort of high-level things in terms of assessment and some basic principles, if you like, of PhD work. Quite obviously, I'm just speaking quite general terms because of all the various disciplines that you're all working in. The second half, I'm going to talk a bit more about specifics in terms of things that you'll all be doing. And I'm going to start out by talking a little bit about first year work, but with a caveat that literature review, as I'm going to talk to you about it, is not something that's only restricted to the first year, but it will be the thing that you're doing most of you'll be doing mostly in the first year. And it's so important to PhD level work that every single one of you will have something that looks like a literature review in your work. It's very traditional in lots of more traditionally formatted PhD theses, and you'll see them if you look at them, for there to be a chapter, usually chapter 2, called literature review, making it absolutely crystal clear that that's what's going on. But it's not by any means necessary. And in fact, some of the best work will involve literature type review type activity in different parts of the thesis after having done a sort of overview early on. And it's totally possible to be very creative with this if you feel like it. And some of the best work, as I said, will have a very sophisticated use of the literature woven through the empirical work or whatever as well. So there are lots of options for doing this, but what I'm going to talk about here is I'm going to talk about it within the parameters of what you need to be doing in the first year, for sure, and also some things that are really important to bear in mind. So when we talk about a review literature, what are we talking about? Well, we use the word literature here in a very traditional sense, but it actually is very wide. So maybe in 1950, the vast majority of PhD work will have been literally just working with text. But now we have to have a much wider view of what literature is. So a really good way of thinking about it is that it's any resource that shapes your study and informs your data or the material that you're working with in some way. It's that which gives you the context in which your work can make its contribution. So this contextual thing I referred to before, really important. The only way you can really get a handle on whether your work's making a contribution is by knowing what everyone else is doing and has done. Most commonly, the review of resource will focus on textual material. So it'll be papers, books, or whatever, reports. But it's not limited to those things. And it's really important to bear that in mind. It can also be media of various forms or artifacts. It's very common now to cite web media, for instance, or recordings or photographic archives or whatever as part of the resource base. The only distinction here is that it is not data in the same sense as the data that you'll be working with in the thesis. It's there to inform it or shape the study. And you need to be clear, and we'll talk about this a bit more next week when we're talking about validity and things like that in data, about what the differences are. But if you focus on this idea that you go to the library and you get books out and you get papers and you read those papers and those shape your ideas about what your work's doing and how you're going to do it, then that's largely the right sort of approach to it. And then it's a case what you do with it. So a review of that, if you like, a review of the resource base is effectively an overview of what other people have done and are doing. It could be ideas, theories, things talking about data in certain various sorts of way, the quality of data. It could be various positions that people have taken on a particular issue that's of relevance to your topic. Often it will be where there are contested ideas, where people disagree with one another. It will often be questions about how can we know that this is reliable. It can be questions about methods. It's a whole range of things. Anything that's relevant in studying your topic at PhD level can be part of the literature review. And it will be important, particularly in disciplines where you're trying something very new or particularly for also where you're working in a discipline that's got a vast amount of literature, where you've got to find a particular niche. So where your topic fits is kind of important here about what this literature review looks like. If you're working in a very traditional discipline like history, then you've got a fairly clear idea about what your resource base looks like, and also you have depending on your topic, have as the potential to be a vast amount of reading, because there'll be a lot written on the area. If you're working in new areas or interdisciplinary work, it will depend upon the nature of the study. So if you're working in a very new area, then there may be a very limited amount of literature, which is a disadvantage in some respects, but it does give you freedom, quite a lot of freedom to set your own project. Interdisciplinary work is a real mixed bag, because on the one hand, it can be something quite new because of the combination of disciplines, but it can also mean that there's more to read, because you've got to read in both areas or more than two areas in some cases. And that's a lot of work. So you've got to have a view of how you're going to tackle that. So understanding how much you're going to have to get on top of in terms of the reading and the ideas and so on is really important early on, and it should be on your agenda right now. And I'll talk a little bit about how you might get there. Secondly, an overview or the review of what other people have said and what they're doing is not in itself sufficient. And this is the crucial bit, really, is that at this level, the review has to be evaluative. It cannot simply say Smith and Jones said whatever. It has to say Smith and Jones said this, and this is why I think that's wrong, or that's why White and Black said something else, or whatever. It has to have a critical component. If you just go ahead and talk about what people said without giving your opinion, you're not doing PhD critical review work. Really important. So critical intervention on your part is really vital. And you've got to start early, or get into the habit of doing it. Whenever you read something and whenever you write about somebody else's work, you have to give an evaluation from your viewpoint about what you think about it, why it's right, why it's wrong, how it could be improved, whatever it might be. You can bring other people into that evaluation, bring resources that agree with your viewpoint to tackle that criticism, but you still need to make a point about what you think about it. So critical intervention is really, really important. There's a nice way of thinking about this. If you think about literature as a conversation, so it's really easy when you're reading things in papers and in books and in libraries, whatever it might be, particularly if they're older work, to think it's a sort of it's an archive, it's a museum piece. But actually, research literature, because it's an ongoing publication enterprise, people are already publishing on various topics all the time. It's a live conversation. It may have started thousands of years ago, and in the older disciplines, it has been going on thousands of years. Some disciplines, it's less than a decade old potentially, but there's still a conversation. And what you're aiming to do in a PhD is to join that conversation. So the key point is that you need to enter into it, and you can only enter into it by making your own contributions. So think about it from a conversation. If you go to a social function and you want to join a conversation with people on the other side of the room, how do you go about doing it? You listen to what's being said to make sure that you want to join in. You make sure you understand what they're talking about, that the language that they're talking is one you can understand. And I mean that in every sense. The issues, the topics that are being discussed, is it something that you want to make a contribution to? If you do, then how do you go about joining in? What is it that you latch onto to make your contribution? And that's a great analogy for thinking about the same sort of thing in research literature review. You've got to find places where you've got an in, if you like, to start your contribution. And you only find that by reading widely and getting a grasp on the issues and making sure that you see where the fault lines lie. You'll quickly see, particularly in those areas where there's a lot of disagreement, that people line up in factions, and you've got to often decide which side of which faction you associate yourself with. There are, in some disciplines, massive disagreements where there's multiple disagreements and factions going on. There are actually very limited areas where people agree with one another, and one of those actually is in certain aspects of natural science where certain things are basically agreed on, and then you go from there. But it's certainly not that way. All you lucky social scientists who've got lots of fighting to deal with amongst methodological and theoretical viewpoints. But there's a variety of things going on. In terms of understanding methodology, key assessment criteria, the only way you can do that, apart from doing it yourself, is by reading about it, seeing where those things occur in the literature and so on, and then making a contribution yourself through your PhD or through papers that you publish that contribute to your PhD. So how do you get to that point? Well, you need two things. You need a strategy for source material, and you need a strategy for reading and dealing with them. And so here are some really good tips. So, as I said, the first thing that I mentioned is that although a key component of the first year is going to be doing this kind of work, fundamentally a massive chunk of this first year will be doing this work. You need to do it throughout the PhD. You will do it in a reduced form as you get into the practical work and so on. But you need to keep reading throughout the PhD, because work will be changing and publishing as you're getting on with your work, that may affect yours. You have to be on top of it. So how do you do it? Well, a really good tip is you read widely at first to identify source material. And obviously, the principal place that the majority of you will be going is in the key journals, but you've got to know what they are. There are thousands of journals out there. Some of them are better than others. Some of them are going to be very prestigious. And that's often a good guide to where you may find cutting edge work, but not always. Depends on the discipline. And reading very widely will get you a sense of what those journals look like. Most of them will be obtainable through electronic resourcing, as the library we were talking about last week. So you've got to start out fairly early on identifying what those journals are for you. You can be experimental. You can test waters, go find things that other people aren't looking at if you want, yeah, bearing in mind that you've got to be critical about what you're using. And then when you find, after the first year, what your main journals are, and the key journals are ones that you will find regularly that have got papers that are interesting to you, into your work. There are journals that you have gone, well, actually, that's a journal I might think about submitting to. You've identified a key journal. And what you should do at that point for the duration of the PhD is identify those key journals that are vital to stay on top of the field, and then 5 or 6 of them, read them regularly, subscribe through various things to those journals. And that way you keep your finger on the pulse in those particular discipline areas. Really, really very simple to do, particularly now everything's electronic. Second point, journals are very much based upon particular editorial positions on the whole. There are exceptions, but a lot of journals, particularly as you get down from the top tier of prestigious journals, you've got to be careful of groupthink. And so it's really, really important to diversify what you read. So I'll talk about this next week. We talk about peer review. But most journals take positions. They're presenting a position or a particular methodological preference, or they've got an angle. That's just natural for publications to do that. So being aware that's really important. And the kind of papers they're going to publish are going to be based on all sorts of things, not least that the fact that the peer reviewers that they use will have certain preferences as well. So bearing that in mind, diversify what you read. Don't stick with the same journal. Don't stick with the same publisher. Read widely and determine where so you've got the full picture. Thirdly, getting alerts on journals is really easy now. So if you don't know how to do this, a library will show you how to do it. But there are all sorts of databases and ways that you can get feeds on publications. So again, it's not the sort of thing that you need to necessarily do manually or all the time. But if you set up RSS feeds and alerts to various journals, they'll send you links to the new things they publish automatically, and you can check them when you've got time to. The work is largely taken out of it. It's not like you have to go, as you used to, into a library and pull the hard copies off the shelf to read every time they were published. It will alert you, and you can do it via fields. You can do topic-based keyword searching and all sorts now. So it's really easy to stay on top of things. And then the databases also may well do that for you as well. So it will pick from the entire field of journals within the database, not just the ones you selected. So again, talk to the librarians about that and get that set up, because it'll save you a lot of work. Fourthly, a little bit off the beaten track, but some of the best work is going on currently in any discipline. At PhD level, you need to be absolutely on top of current work. And the big problem with that is that the vast majority isn't yet published. So you won't find it in the journals. You won't find it in the databases. So there are two strategies for this, one of which is a lot more work than the other. Okay, so the one that's a lot of work, and it makes sense to start doing it now, is that you should be able to identify the key university departments for the kind of work you do. It depends on what kind of work you're doing, where those departments are. It could be UK only, it could be European, it could be worldwide. It's up to you, but it makes sense for a number of reasons to start with the UK, since that's on our doorstep. And then sign up for the networks, the newsletters, whatever it is. And if they are relatively reachable, which we're lucky in the north of England to have this, you actually, a lot of universities within a fairly short distance, you might be able to get involved with things going on at that department as an external participant. Very, very useful way to network, very useful way to find out what others are doing. But the key thing is make sure it's relevant to what you do. Make sure that there's a link to the research you're doing, and then you'll be able to find out quite a lot about what's going on currently at that department and also through the networks. Lastly, online thesis repositories, really important. As I said, a lot of work isn't published. A lot of PhD work isn't published. All right. So how do you get at it? Well, Ethos, the British Library Service, but also every single university, the vast majority of them in UK will have this now, and American universities, European universities, and a lot of others as well will have online thesis repository. So go to the site and start searching for the PhD in the repository, and you'll find work in recently examined and passed theses will only be hosted, and that's work that you can use in your work as part of your literature. But it's also an important way to stay on top of what other people are doing, because originality as a key issue for contribution means that you need to make sure that you're not duplicating the work of others. What happens if the work you've been working on for 3 or 4 years ends up to have been duplicated pretty much by a student working in another institution? An examiner knowing that and then saying, what about the work of X, and you not knowing about it is an issue. It will mean you having to rework the project to pass. So staying on top of the field, being aware of what others are doing is vital. And a good way of doing that is through the networking and through the repositories. Reading strategy. So I shouldn't have to say this, but I will. Be prepared for an enormous amount of reading. There is really no choice. Some of you will have to do more of it than others. So if you're working in humanities, it'll be pretty much 95% reading for the first 2 years. If you're working in a natural science, you start to do a lot of reading early on because you need to get on top of the literature. But it's a reading heavy project, a PhD. It will involve lots of screen time, lots of reading of books and papers. But to make your job easier, how do you read more effectively? What is the most important for my work is the key question. You can read indiscriminately and you can read badly. So what you've got to do always is be focused on how does this contribute to what I'm doing. So there are a number of key things. First of all, not everything that's published is worth it. There's a lot of dreadful papers out there. I guarantee you'll find quite a lot of them. So you've got to make decisions fairly early on. And they may be dreadful, not in the sense of the quality of the paper, but that they're simply not relevant to what you're doing, or they are way off base in terms of the kind of thing you're doing or whatever. Yeah. And there's also a lot of work out there that's pretty trivial. It's not going to be something you're going to want to bother with for PhD level work. So read the abstract, read what they say in the final paragraphs about the conclusions, and ask yourself the question, is it worth the effort? If it isn't, move on. If it is worth reading, then you can start to tackle it in a variety of different ways, which I'll come to in a sec. Another good thing to do in the journals that you read, identify what are called survey of field or summary papers, and you'll see these periodically appearing in all sorts of places. They could be review articles, they name different things depending on the journal and the field. But these are papers where a normally prominent researcher in the field or an academic in the field will give a review of developments over a period of time. These are invaluable. They will save you a lot of time going and finding things. If you use this as an orientation, you will be well set. So find them and use them. It'll save you a lot of time early on. Fifthly, identify the key things you have to read. So there will be seminal, absolutely classic work in all your disciplines. You have to read it and you have to know what it says. So make sure you find those papers and read them properly. Beware of secondary or tertiary sources. So in other words, if a paper is seminal or classic, it's a primary source. Beware of what other people have to say about it before you've read it yourself and made your own mind about it. And this I'm going to come back to next week quite a bit, but you really, really have to be careful about others' interpretations, because not only can people misinterpret something and therefore lead you astray, but they can also willfully misinterpret things to give their own position, which is even doubly dangerous. So read primary sources, make your own mind up about it, and then go and look at the commentaries. Scan reading is a really, really useful technique, and some of you may already know how to do this, but to scan read something quickly to get a bit deeper. So you've decided you want to read something, right, through the abstract and the summary, the conclusions or whatever. So the first thing you do is you start at the top and you read first few words in paragraphs quickly through it until you get to the bits that you want to read a bit more carefully. So you get a basic grasp on the paper, and then you tuck into read more carefully those bits that you need to read. In reality, there will be very few papers that you need to read absolutely word for word. That's just the nature of it. And the way you get to know which of those papers are is by scan reading first. And then when you find something that you need to digest properly, then you read it absolutely properly, carefully and critically, and use those papers to determine what it is that you're doing and so on. Lastly, always take notes. You should never be reading without taking notes. You should always have a pen or some way of marking up whatever it is you're reading. You can mark actually on the papers or whatever if they're electronic, whatever it might be, and then find a way to transfer those later, or you can take traditional notes, but you always need to be taking notes. And also, as I'll talk about next week, a bit more citation referencing material for the papers you're looking at. Using a system like EndNote, absolutely vital. Even 15 years ago, you would still not have been able to use software to manage referencing. Now you have it, you can get it for free at the university, so use it. It'll allow you to drop everything into it, and it'll store and organize things for you and drop them into your work at the end of when you're writing it. The advantage with it mostly is that it means you don't get bogged down in losing referencing material, but also that it formats it for you as well in whatever style you need to reference in, which is a lot of work if you have to do it manually. So get familiar with EndNote early on and start using it. Right, so in terms of review itself, when you're putting it together, so things not to do. Scope. So you can try and do too much, and you can do not enough effectively. So a literature review is vital, but it's only one element. If your literature review is 1/3 of your thesis, it's too long. Having not enough is a question of what it is that you're doing really, and what sort of sources you're looking at. But not having enough is dangerous. Doing too much is basically salvageable. Not having enough is potentially dangerous because you haven't seen something vital that infects your work. So you've got to judge it right. How much you read and what you take from your reading and so on is up to you. And it will, as I said, be dependent on what kind of work you do in the discipline you're working in, how much there is to cover and so on. The more it is that you need to cover, the more you need to be asking questions about whether your project's too big, whether you need to narrow focus, create limitations on it, create parameters, define it more carefully, and so on. When you come to write this stuff, and you'll be doing this fairly early on, it's a typical early stage piece of writing, is simply listing sources, yeah, because that's not being critical. So whenever you're writing about a particular paper, a particular thinker, theorist, whatever it might be, it's listing it, referencing it, referring to it, and then evaluating it and giving your opinion. Be very careful about referring to things you haven't read firsthand. By this, I mean it's very, very easy to see a paper or an idea referred to in one person's word that isn't by them. So they're referring or citing something else. And instead of going and looking at it yourself, you refer on that person's reference. That's really, really not recommended. Always look at something before you refer it to it yourself. It might be that that person's, as I said, misinterpreted it, or there could be more problematic issues to it as well. So it's always worth looking at something. If it's worth citing in your work, go and have a look at it. Never refer to things that you don't understand. Okay, so it's really easy to get caught up in the sort of language of a particular paper or a particular theoretical position, and some of those positions can be actually much more difficult or complex than are first appreciated. And the example I've got here is from a Viva in which I shared a Viva with a student who, when it came to the Viva, had referred to a theory, I think largely because they thought it was quite an interesting theory rather than it being particularly relevant to what they were doing. And the examiner was a bit of an expert in the theory and asked them questions about it, and they hadn't the first clue. That was not a good experience. So as an example of the sort of worst case scenario, that's if you're going to quote something, you're going to refer to something in the PhD, an examiner can ask you about it. So you have to be able to talk about it. If it's there, it's fair game for them to ask you about. So always make sure that you include whatever you include, you understand and could talk about. And then lastly, as I said, first year activity, lots of reading, lots of note taking, lots of scoping of what's out there. And that will take up the vast majority of your first year. But you can't stop reading. You have to keep on top of it throughout. If you find yourself not reading and not looking at journals at some point, you're doing it wrong. And it's very, very easy when you get in the lab or in the field or wherever to stop reading. And that's fine because there will be the priority. But you've got to find a way of staying on top of things. Because it might be that somebody publishes something that completely undermines everything you're doing and you don't know about it. So it's really, really important to stay on top of what's out there. Right. We are coming to the end of the session and I'm running out of time, I'm afraid. I might run a little bit over because I've given myself some flexibility with a 4 o'clock slot, and depending on questions. Thesis structure and formats. Things to think about here is that the thesis is structured, and you'll all have seen, if you haven't seen, please have a look at some on the repository, that the thesis is structured in a traditional chapter-based format. There are word counts associated with different theses. I will not go into that today because it's very early on, but they're in the regulations. But we don't actually, it's a fairly flexible sort of system. You're not going to be penalized for being significantly over or under a word count that's provided as a guidance. But organization of chapters is a key one because it's very easy again to have too many chapters in a thesis, and you need to find about the ideal number of chapters for the work you're doing. I would say that an ideal number for a natural science, bench science type thesis is probably around 5 or 6. And you might be looking at maybe 6 or 7 for a more text heavy thesis. But again, these are decisions you take. There is no ideal. Okay, so it's really important that the chapter organization works for what it is you're doing. Too few chapters mean you've got things grouped together that should probably be separated. Too many can be very disjointed. So it's decisions about that sort of thing and how easy it is to follow the work. Always bear in mind that at PhD level, you're trying to achieve 2 distinct purposes. Firstly, that you've got research that you want to describe and present as a contribution. And secondly, that you need to pass the assessment. The assessment criteria you need to evidence as part of the writing and as part of the thesis. So those 2 go together. that you must always have the appropriate scholarly tools, citation and abstracts, all of which are described in the regulations, and that the style of the thesis has to be in a particularly appropriately formal style. Again, I do lots of stuff on that over the years in summer writing and so on support. You've got to know what your citation format is. Essential to a PhD. There is no easy way of summarizing this. You need to identify what the standard is for your discipline. And the easiest way, what are the major journals using? What's your supervisor using? That's the easiest way to get a handle on this. But whatever you use, consistency is the crucial issue. But as I said, if you use EndNote, it'll format things by flipping a preference button so you can easily reformat. Right, finally, and I'm running out of it. Time is probably your greatest challenge. So one of the things that people underestimate is how sheer difficult it is to stay on top of research at PhD level. We talked about this last week. You've got 4 years or 7 years, depending on your mode. The amount of time you'll be spending on the work will ebb and flow depending on what you're doing. But the key thing is momentum. It's really, really easy to lose it. When you lose momentum, things start going wrong. So it's really important to be realistic about what time you've got available and how to manage it. So as I said at the beginning, the number one reason why people are unsuccessful at PhD level is not because of academic reasons, but because they're not organized. So there are some crucial basic tips on managing the PhD. It's a huge project. It lasts you several years. If you're part-time, it's even harder because it lasts for so long. So break things down into achievable points which you know that you can get to, and consistently reevaluate whether it's working. We give you the most basic annual review. Every year we're going to want to see some work and we assess it internally. But that's not sufficient. Within those years, you're going to have to break things down further. Your supervisor will almost certainly help you to do this because they're going to want to see work. They're probably going to give you things to do, or advise you to check or do certain things. So that's a conversation. But you know your propensity or otherwise for organization. If you are really organized, this will be a doddle. But if you're really organized, or if you have any tendency to kind of easily get distracted and go off and do something else rather than the task that you should be doing, then you really need to have a strategy here. Because I'm absolutely convinced that organization or lack of it is the major problem for the vast majority of students who are not successful. You've got to balance focusing or detail activity against the big picture stuff continually. So if you've got your head down doing technical work, it's really easy to lose sight of the big picture, why you're doing it. Likewise, if you spend all your time doing big picture and not the detail, you won't have the level of work that's required at this level. Be prepared for things going wrong. You should always have plan B, C, D, and E in place. Contingency is really important, and that's less of a problem when you're working purely with text, for instance. But if you're recruiting participants, you're doing any kind of project in the field where you're working with other people, you've got to be prepared for things not working properly. The amount of PhD studies that get derailed early on because they need 400 people to be recruited into a trial and they can only recruit 100 of them. Well, it happens all the time. So have contingency, always have other options, never leave yourself without any. Write as you're going along, don't leave it till the end. And there's this idea that you do the research and then write about it, which is old-fashioned and wrong. You write as you're going along, not simply because it becomes easier at the end to put the thesis together, but also that if you have a problem with writing, you'll find out about it fairly early on and you can do something about it. But it's just easier to write as you're going along. So taking notes and writing about things as you're reading them, writing up experiments, writing up case studies or whatever it might be, just keeps you agile and enables you to get the thesis done more quickly. If you leave it to the end, it's a massive job. It's like writing a novel, writing a PhD of 80,000 words, and it is a serious bit of, it takes a long time. So break it down by writing early, and a lot of that you may end up using as the basis for chapters and so on. And lastly, you've got to plan activity, timetable activity, Don't just free fall it. But bear in mind that the one advantage of the PhD over any other kind of academic course is that you are in charge of quite a lot of what's going on here, a high proportion of what's going on. And you're not required to be on the whole, anything at a particular time on a particular day. There will be exceptions, but on the whole, it'll be mutual agreement when you meet your supervisor and so on. So that gives you a lot of flexibility to work when you're at your best, in the place that suits you, in the way that you prefer to. And that, for a lot of people, is a real great, one of the nice things about a PhD. If you like more structure, then you're going to have to create it. So those flexibilities can be, for some people, more tricky. And if you're used to a highly structured course, as you will have been through talk courses, this is very different, and you've got to be confident in doing things yourself. But bear in mind, there are going to be times when you are basically exhausted, where you can't really do very much, but there's no useless time on a PhD. There's all sorts of things that you need to be doing, like filing documents, keeping reference notes, tidying up folders with various data packages in and so on, all of which doesn't require you to be on top of your game, but needs doing at some point. So again, this is wise use of your time. If you've got an hour and a half on a Friday afternoon, pretty much done most of everything you should do, but you know there's that little job to do that you put off. Well, get it done, get it out of the way. This is good use of time when you're doing a PhD, because believe me, it does go quickly. Right, I think I'm going to wrap this up because I talked about this last week and I want to leave time for some questions, but there's a few slides at the end here with a few bits and bobs that I'll leave you to look at on your own. And obviously you can get in touch with me directly if you want to talk about anything I've covered today. I know it's a whirlwind tour in a different world where we did things on campus. We'd have spent at least an afternoon, a whole afternoon, and in many years ago, we'd have had a whole day to cover some of this stuff. But I do want to refer you to what I'm doing next week, where I'll pick up on some of these threads again in a slightly different context. And then also you will see that over the next year or so, there'll be various things on offer that you may find useful. I do quite a lot on writing, and I do quite a bit on sort of critical approaches to analysis and things like that, in addition to the things that are available to staff on our wider development program. So if there's anything you want to go back over, you can look at the recording. I'll send you the slides, and then also after you've had digested some of it and you might have specific questions for your own project that you want to think about, please do get in touch with me and I will get back to you. It doesn't appear that anyone's dropped anything in the chat. If anyone does want to do that before we log off, please do it now. Otherwise, I will see you next week, same place, same time. Looks like you're all silent. Okay, right. I'll leave it there, but I'll look forward to seeing you all next week.